Prepare for Inauguration Day. Ever since the fallout of what happened last week, we know that things could be a little more contentious here on January 20th than what we originally anticipated. And is there an outside possibility of something like martial law or something else similar to it occurring because of the events that happened on that day? Stick around for the rest of the video. We're going to talk about what could happen on Inauguration Day, what the states around the country are doing to prepare for it, and how you can prepare for it by just being away from those areas as best you can. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about why we need to prepare for Inauguration Day. Obviously, what happened last week is a ramp up towards what we could expect here on January 20th. And during that event last week, we all expected things to maybe not even happen at all, and then they did. And now state capitals around the country are being warned by the FBI that armed protests are scheduled to be at every state capital throughout the entire country. Now, whether or not that's true, that's the memo that's being sent out. So states are starting to prepare for it. And we know that somewhere between 15 and 20,000 National Guard troops are on their way to Washington, D.C. in order to secure the Capitol during the inauguration process. Now, I know I've been preparing for things like this for a long time. I know you have too, and we all know that the possibility of something like a martial law style scenario is definitely in the cards, more so than maybe it used to be. So if you're preparing for things like martial law and you want to stay ahead of what's happening out there, hit the subscribe button below so that way we can make sure that everybody here stays on top of what's happening and we can all be prepared and stay in communication together. Because if a martial law scenario ever does occur, we're going to need to communicate as best we can in order to make sure we don't fall behind and suddenly become isolated and no longer know what's happening. Okay, especially if you're like me and you live in rural North Dakota, you kind of need to know what you guys are up to. Okay, so state capitals are starting to deploy National Guard troops in order to help their state police, and that way they can basically secure their capital. So the states are going through, the governors are activating National Guard, and I'm going to give you some ideas and examples as what's happening around the country based on some different states' actions, so you have some ideas of what you can expect in your area, okay? So Ohio, 580 National Guard troops are activated in order to support the state police there. So they are anticipating armed protests, so they're going to activate the National Guard now to make sure that the state capitol is secured, okay? Minnesota plans to activate the National Guard sometime on Tuesday or Wednesday. So if you're in Minnesota and you're worried about being around the state capitol, know that Tuesday and Wednesday is go time at that point, okay? Oregon is going to use the National Guard to support the police because they know they've had tons of unrest throughout this entire past year, and now they are pretty much 100% guaranteed to have more of it during the inauguration process. So they're activating the National Guard, but they're not going to tell the public where they're going to be activated or at what locations they're going to be stationed at. Now, I have to assume a lot of that has to do with the fact that, yes, of course, they are worried about where these protesters are going to show up because we know that there's been a lot of activity in that state. However, it is one of those things where they're just not advertising it to the public, which always makes you feel somewhat suspicious, of course, okay? And just be aware, the National Guard troops, especially the ones here being deployed in DC and everywhere else right now, they're armed, okay? The military police section of them and the law enforcement section of them are armed. It's not one of those situations where it's all just about, less lethal situations, okay? But the majority of the troops are not armed. It's just the ones that have law enforcement experience, but we are seeing photos, we're seeing pictures, we're seeing images of the troops deploying and unloading their weapons racks and getting their rifles ready to go. So just keep in mind that they are taking this whole situation a little more seriously, okay? Like I said, 15 to 20,000 troops being deployed to Washington, D.C. is double what usually is deployed during an inauguration process, okay? So Washington State has hundreds of National Guard troops activated to protect their state capital. Michigan just had their state commission come together and actually legislate away the ability to open carry at the state capitol. So now states are actually putting in new rules and laws into place in order to limit what you're able to do at the state capitol in preparedness for this whole situation. So Michigan says no more open carry around their state capitol. There you go. Now Georgia has had fences constructed around their capital since the summer because of all the unrest and everything else going on. And they've had a deployment of National Guard troops activated since that time as well. But they are still maintaining that and they're still prepared for more unrest coming up here very soon. So these are just examples of what's happening around the country in every state. So if you're in a state and you maybe live in the state capital, maybe you're in Sacramento, California, okay? You need to make sure that you are prepared for that area to be a little bit more tumultuous than other areas might be. And if I were you, and this is just my opinion, I'd probably avoid being in a state capital on the Inauguration Day, especially if you don't want to be part of the fray. That being said, national emergency was declared March 13th, 2020 in relation to the pandemic, okay? So the national emergency situation is still current. So is there a possibility for martial law? Does it seem like a martial law scenario is likely or even happening right now around the country? Well, when you have National Guard deploying to the Capitol, and you have National Guard deploying to every other state capital, and you have states getting ready for what they're expecting to be armed unrest in many ways, you have to consider the fact that this is a possibility that could occur. It's not likely, and in fact, most people assume that it won't because generally martial law is used in time of war, and currently we're technically in peacetime. However, that line could be blurred pretty easily based on whatever events occur on January 20th. So as people are prepared and people are worried about prepping for scenarios that are out of our control, you should be at least open to the idea that a martial law situation could come into place due to whatever the outcome or the activities of that day could be, okay? And understand that all the cards are in place for a martial law situation to be declared. We just aren't in a current scenario right now where it's warranted. However, there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of talk about the use of the Insurrection Act. And that could be a situation that comes into play where martial law, de facto at least, is basically declared. Now, yes, it's not martial law, but what the Insurrection Act does is it gives the president the ability to use the military and the National Guard, at least on the federal level, to quell any civil disorder, rebellion, or insurrection within the country. And it lets him bypass the Posse Comitatus Act to make sure that it's illegal to use military against U.S. citizens on our own soil. And that is something that's been talked about and speculated a lot. Now, you could say, well, if you have a last-ditch effort and it's on your way out and you want to try something crazy just to try to see what you can get done, of course, that's an option you could use. But it is also an option that can be used if any of these protests get out of control. And if anything happens to the point where force is necessary in order to stop whatever might be occurring, that Insurrection Act could be utilized. And then what are the limits and the bounds of that Insurrection Act at that point? We'll see, okay? But what I'm saying is that there's already states of emergency being declared in places like Washington, D.C. and Virginia, which allows the people in power there to put things like curfews into place and more. And you have to understand that even if martial law is not declared, when you have armed National Guard troops throughout the country at every state capital, and you have states of emergency being declared, and you have national emergencies declared, and you have the possibility of the use of something like the Insurrection Act because of the fact that interpretation of whatever a rebellion might be, or interpretation of civil disorder, or interpretation of insurrection is up to the person who decides to utilize it. So, understand that there is a precedent set for these things to be possible. Is it likely? I don't think so. Just to be honest, I don't think it's likely that any of these things occur in the sense of martial law being declared or that the Insurrection Act is utilized. However, are curfews going to be put in place? Probably. Is the National Guard deployed in many, many states and being activated? Yes. Are we going to still be under a national emergency? Of course we are. So is the possibility of martial law there? Yes. Is the possibility of the Insurrection Act being utilized there? Yes. So prepare as if it can happen or it will happen. Because honestly, you don't want to find yourself in a state capital when suddenly martial law is declared and routes are locked down and perimeters are closed off and you're no longer allowed to exit. You're no longer allowed to leave. And suddenly you don't have the ability to move freely. And suddenly you find yourself arrested without any probable cause because under martial law, things like that are possible. Okay? So prepare for it and do your best. And what they say in a lot of self-defense and a lot of concealed carry classes and everything else related to that is avoidance is the best option. And in these situations, if you don't want to be part of that fray, then you need to avoid those areas. And if you live in a state capital, you need to be prepared now for things to get out of control or out of hand very quickly, especially if you live in Washington, D.C., but you already know that, so hopefully you're already prepared. But just saying, if you're there, maybe you shouldn't be. So these are things we need to consider, we need to watch out for. We currently have less than a week until this happens. So do what you can now to be ahead of the game, okay? And make sure you stay as prepared as possible. With everything going on so far in 2021, we need to understand this is what's happening lately, and we need to be prepared for it as best we can. So if you have anything else to say about what could happen in the sense of martial law, in the sense of the Insurrection Act, leave it in the comments below. There's a lot of conversation to be had, and there's a lot of speculation, but there's also a lot of precedent set for these things to become possible. And if you have anything else for me, always go to magicprepper.com, send me an info or a contact info form, and that way I can get back to you as soon as possible. But without anything else to say about the possibility of a martial law scenario, why we need to watch out for January 20th, Inauguration Day, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.